Where is Steve Rogers right now? And is it possible that the old Captain America is actually dead? After the battle for Earth and the fate of the universe had been resolved, Captain America finally bowed away from the limelight as a superhero and sought out a proper retirement that he was never allowed to have. Upon returning the Infinity Stones to their rightful places in history and across timelines, he returned to the year 1949 and lived out a life of solitude with Peggy Carter. But this is not the last that we would see of the Captain. After passing down the shield to Sam Wilson, we know of an old retired version of Steve Rogers that has returned to the mainline MCU. So then, where did this version of the character go? Is he dead? Is he in hiding? Or might he be somewhere else entirely? Well, today, my friends, let's see if we can't figure out exactly where Old Man Rogers is today, and if we'll ever see the character again. For this video, we'll be considering a few options, and the first option to discuss is that shortly following the events of Endgame, Steve Rogers did in fact die of old age after making it back to the point in which he left. When Steve handed off the shield to Sam, he lived for 27 years before going into the ice and an additional 12 years after being thawed out, making him physically around 40 by the time that he would return to Peggy. After arriving in 1949, however, he lived out an additional 74 years before returning to the present, meaning that physically speaking, this version of Steve Rogers is in the realm of 115 years old. Even with the aid of the super soldier serum, Steve is noticeably past his prime and is likely to die fairly soon. In terms of a heroic end, this is one of the best options that such an iconic character could ask for, a peaceful death at an old age after a lifetime of helping those in need. There are a few interesting details that seem to suggest that this might not be the case, however, as the dodgy nature with which Sam and Bucky talk about Steve seems to indicate that something else may have occurred. They never refer to him as having died, and they only ever refer to him as gone, which is an interesting choice of description. So then, what are some of the other options for what may have happened to Steve Rogers? One possibility is that after handing off the shield to Sam and allowing him to continue the legacy of Captain America, that Steve returned to the timeline where he had lived out his retirement with Peggy. There is a bit of ambiguity surrounding what exactly happened with Steve's retirement, and if he's been lying on a separate timeline, or if he's been living in the background of the mainline Marvel universe. Now, with the full expansion of the multiverse having taken place though, it's becoming more and more likely that Steve lived out a timeline on a new branch with Peggy as a founding member of S.H.I.E.L.D., and ventured to a timeline separate from the mainline MCU. This would allow Steve to continue his career as Captain America without having to live in hiding, and let atrocities around the world play out when he knows that he can do something to stop it. Captain America, after all, is not the type of person to sit by while others are being hurt, especially if he can do something about it. In this new timeline, it's possible that he saved Bucky much sooner than he was originally able to, weeded out the remainder of Hydra that had been infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D., and helped save countless lives. What this would mean, however, is that he now has an entirely new universe to call home, with loved ones, family members, and potentially even children and grandchildren. If this is the case, then Steve might have returned to this timeline after handing the shield down to Sam, and this might be why he and Bucky simply refer to Steve as being gone without ever having a funeral. It's important to remember that the ceremony Sam attends is not a funeral, but instead an event to donate the shield to the Smithsonian and allow the mantle of Captain America to be officially retired with Steve. This possibility would allow Steve to continue to live out his retirement, but he would no longer be alone as he would be on Earth 616. As for where this timeline might be, however, and if we ever get to see it, remains to be seen, but the idea of there being another universe in which Captain America had foresight of the future and was able to help produce a more secure Earth is interesting. If he is still on Earth 616, however, or rather, if he has always been on Earth 616, then where is he now? If he was forced to live in the background of the mainline universe, then he wouldn't have his own reality to get back to, and therefore he would still be around. So then, if this is what happened, then where could Steve Rogers be right now? The Russo brothers, the directors of The Winter Soldier, Civil War, and the final two Avengers films, has been asked about Peggy's children. It was noted that there was never a father shown, and the idea was that the father was always intended to be Steve Rogers. This indicates that at least in the director's minds, that Steve has been living in the background of the mainline MCU and didn't actually create a deviant timeline by displacing himself in the past. With that, let's discuss the idea that Steve has been there the entire time. Joaquin Torres asks Sam about the idea that Steve has secretly been living out his retirement on a hidden base on the moon, to which Sam brushes off, which might not be all that crazy in concept though. Originally, this idea was proposed because the wider public doesn't actually know what happened to Steve Rogers, and it is never explicitly said. Some may believe that he died in the battle for Earth alongside Tony and Natasha, but given Scott Lang's memoir and it detailing the events of Endgame, it seems like much of the world knows Steve did not die. They just didn't know what actually happened to him following the battle with Thanos. This is why Torres asks about the secret moon base, which is played off as a joke, but S.H.I.E.L.D., SWORD, and Saber each have numerous extraterrestrial bases and outposts in orbit of the world. It's not crazy to believe that Sam might have been offered a position on one of these bases as a tactician or a leader. But if we look really closely, this theory doesn't actually hold up at all. Throughout the Marvels, we get to see an up-close and personal look at Nick Fury's Saber Station and its functionality, and of course Captain Rogers is nowhere to be found. It seems that if Nick Fury helped to relocate Steve onto one of these bases, that he would have enlisted his help during the Dar-Ben attacks and the Skrull invasion of Earth. If Nick Fury had a hand in relocating Steve, then it's likely that he would have called on him for aid at some point in the recent past, indicating that if Steve retired on Earth 616, that it is even out of Nick Fury's view. This means that if Steve never lived on an alternate timeline, that he seems to have died in the time between his return in Endgame and the debut of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, just a few short months later. So now, it simply depends on if Steve branched a new reality with his presence, and that a new reality resulted, which even officials at Marvel Studios itself cannot seem to agree on. But anyway, my friends, what do you think happened to Steve Rogers after he handed down the shield to Sam Wilson and the title of Captain America? Do you agree with the Russos that Steve Rogers has been in the mainline MCU this entire time in the shadows and is the father of Peggy's children? Or do you believe that he lived out his retirement on a new timeline? And if so, what do you think awaits the Captain when he returns home? How do you think this reality is different? Or do you believe that he's been living in the past the entire time? Has Steve Rogers officially died, or is there a chance that we might see a version of the character again sometime soon? Thank you as always, my friends, for visiting the channel today. Hit that subscribe button to assemble and join our team, and I hope you're having a great one.